Hello and welcome to Homer Weston's Old Mate, the podcast. My name's Phil Walton. I'm your host this evening. Alongside me is, once again, it's Stu Butler. Good evening, Stu.
Good evening, Phil. It's good to be back for the third time.
It is, isn't it? It's good. I've been looking forward to this all week. It's been a long week with some long evenings, but I've been looking forward to getting back into this. I've been really enjoying them.
Yeah, same here, mate. Same here. Fortunately, the editing so far has been good. We've worked around a couple of technical issues that my lack of video editing threw up, but we're working around that. And yeah, it's going well. I think episodes 1 and 2 have been well received.
Yeah, I've had some good feedback that people are listening to it and liking it. So that's very good. That's very good. We said on the last episode as well that we would check in. So still sober, still well.
Still sober. Yeah. Mental health, very good. Exercising daily, running 3 miles a day for September, a little personal challenge, nothing charity based, just keep myself active. I can't continue it forever, but it's just a little challenge I've set myself, and it seems to help the brain somewhat. So when the brain's good, the rest of life is a bit easier for Stu.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. Cool. So we'll check in with the reflections or anything else like that. So I said that I had a bit of feedback from a couple of people that had listened to the podcast, and yeah, just I think you'd thrown up a few things around how much it costs or the lack of, and I think it had had surprised a few people as well. Being in and also just I guess the volume, the frequency, and the duration that you're able to keep that up. We're kind of touching on 20 years, and when I started doing the maths around that, I think we calculated around 18 years before it started. Well, for you getting home, that's like 6,500 days. Now you wouldn't have been drinking every single one of those days, I don't know, but it sounds like it was the vast majority. So I think that was not a surprise to people, because obviously this is the nature of the podcast, but it was that's a mighty effort to be maintaining it for that length of time, I think was the feedback.
Yeah, and when I read the numbers that you sent through, the pub years, the non-alcoholic years were the expensive years. That would have been, had I couldn't have maintained that with a mortgage, wife, and young family. Not that the wife's expensive; she pays for herself. But I couldn't have kept up, drinking to the pub, because even back a darts night was probably a £40 or £50 night, towards sort of the end of my pub going. But yeah, as regards to the alcoholism, it wasn't overly expensive. But prior to that, I would have been drinking 4 or 5 nights a week. Not blackout drunk, but I would have been drinking 4 or 5 nights a week comfortably. Wednesday would have been the day off the middle of the week, but every other night, really. There was periods when I was playing pool as well. That was a Tuesday. So Wednesday would have been but then Man United might have been playing in the Champions League, so that could have been a pub night for all I can remember.
Right. Okay. So, and then the end of that episode is we're going to kind of pick up from the end of that episode. So if people remember, and just a bit of a recap, that we talked about, from your point of view, you had the arrival of a newborn, and that kind of catalyzed a behavior change where you started to hide your alcohol.
Yeah.
And by hiding your alcohol and therefore hiding your intake comes kind of a series of secrets and lies and deceit that come with that. And it's not just talking about your wife and that relationship, but the relationships around you with your mates and your drinking buddies and all of that sort of stuff. And I think we're going to delve into that today. And that's going to be the focus of this episode. But I also appreciate there's a lot here to cover. And we're going to take our time with it rather than just skim the surface. So it might be, we'll get to kind of 40 odd minutes or so, and we might decide to just stop where we are and we'll do a part 2 at another point. But that's where we're going. Sound all right to you?
Yeah. I mean, yes, and for the listeners, you know, this is what this podcast is about, the down and dirty almost, and it will there'll be some pretty brutal stuff in there, and I will, I'm not going to start crying, I'm not going to beg for sympathy, but I will try, if my tone of voice sounds a little bit positive while discussing it, that's certainly not me not taking responsibility. I am full of regrets for my actions, but I obviously have moved on and have been forgiven myself and forgiven by those closest and those not so close to me. So we'll try and approach this sensitive subject with a positive tone of voice, but it's not a naive or, it's not me not understanding the enormity of a lot of problems I cause for myself and my loved ones.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to start on. I think the context being that this is a time in your life that you've absolutely moved on from, and yeah, we just deal with it as best we can and as sensitively as we can. So there we go. So let's pick up then. Last episode, let's pick up where we left off with talking about your alcohol. You talked very briefly about you would go and do the weekly shop, the weekly grocery shop.
Yeah.
And while you were there, you would sneak in a couple of bottles of vodka or whatever else you were drinking, and then kind of the household pot of money would pay for that, but you would also subsidize that with your own pocket money that you've got that's kind of yours, Stuart's money for spending. So was that the only kind of example that you were able to with hiding the expenditure of that you were going through? Was it just through the weekly shops, or was there any other way how did that play out with you being able to buy it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I would stop twice a week on average and do. In my head, I used to think if I could spend 30 quid on shopping and £10 on vodka, so that the bill was say 40 quid, I reckoned I could come home and easily that'd be 2 or 3 bags of shopping. And I would be of the opinion that, my wife wouldn't notice that, she wouldn't sit there and calculate what I had in the 3 bags or the 2 bags, whatever it was. There were other, there was Christmas every year at work. I've mentioned in a previous podcast, we'd get a bottle of spirits. That was always hidden in the latter years. But as the greenkeeping staff, there's 16 of us, and we're given a bottle of wine each by the permit holders. Lots of roughy, tufty greenkeepers aren't bothered by wine, so they'd be quite happy for Stu to take their bottle of wine, no bother. So that could be 6 or 7 bottles of wine, and that would probably live in the car, because that time of year my thinking then was, I'll just keep 3 or 4 bottles in the car. If anyone goes in the car, sorry, meant to bring them in, no problem. It's just from, the lads at work said I could take them. Apart from that, really, no. I mean, I wasn't a gambler, so I didn't, it's not like I'd put a bet on every week. I had savings, but I never really needed to dip into them. I used to be those 2 bottles of vodka and then the 4 or 5 other bottles of vodka I'd buy myself. But like I've said before, there was no other outgoings. I had my game. I'd spend 60 quid on FIFA once a year, and that's all. That would be my Xbox in.
Okay. So, and then a question that kind of occurred to me really was kind of the lengths that you might go to cover the tracks. So did receipts not come home?
Yeah.
That's kind of evidence really that there's a bottle of vodka, hide it, but then it's not in the groceries.
Quickly learnt from that one. I've always been a guy who'd ask for the receipt. Nowadays they ask you in the shop, do you want your receipt? And I always said yes. I think just record keeping, possibly come home and check if something was missing. I very quickly realised that needed to go in a bin as soon as I got out of the shop. I could never get out of the habit of saying no. I think I wanted to make sure I had the receipt in case something was missing. Heaven help me, it was some alcohol. But I quickly learnt that needed to not come home, and I stopped using co-op cards because I used to go. It used to be a co-oping deal, and I didn't know. I still don't know if it registers everything you buy. But what I didn't want is a letter coming through the door saying we've got a great offer on Smirnoff because you've bought 48 bottles in the last 2 weeks. So perhaps you'd like to hear about our alcohol promotion. So it was things like that, covering tracks in that way, most definitely.
Okay, so interesting. So it's kind of beyond. You've given it due consideration that it's beyond kind of the physical hiding of the bottle that will be somewhere in the house, and we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
But you've also thought, actually, there must be something in your head where you go, this is not going to be seen in a good light, so therefore I need to try and hide what's happening because it will invite unwanted questions.
Yeah, it goes back to that point in the let's say the early stages where I was drinking. I don't think I wasn't alcohol dependent, but for anxiety purposes, I needed to drink, or I thought I needed to drink. I was still enjoying drinking, but obviously I was aware that, let's say in the early months, if I was buying 3 bottles of vodka a week, I was well aware that that was ridiculous and wouldn't be tolerated by my wife. So, it very quickly became from source when I was at the supermarket, let's make sure this purchase isn't registered and let's make sure the alcohol is hidden pretty much as soon as I get home. So it even got to the stage where, timing of buying the alcohol would be timed around, coming home to an empty house.
Right. Okay. So making sure that you've got the opportunity, you're creating time and opportunity, not just to buy it, but to stash it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. So talk to us about that. Where was the go-to place to hide it?
Early vodka days, because I remember I had a year or two where I cycled my electric bike to work every day, and the vodka just used to go in the pannier once I bought it, and then the electric bike would go down in the shed. So for a few weeks, possibly a month or two, the vodka used to live in the shed, and then after dark or after my wife had gone to bed, I would then make the journey down to the garden and pour what I felt I would need into another container and make the journey back up the garden. It's only, it's not a big garden. I don't live in a mansion. But then I soon obviously got bored of doing that. Perhaps the winter months kicked in, and it very quickly went from, if I was on the bike, I would, in the morning, knowing I'd be buying the alcohol, I would pack an extra water bottle, a cycling bottle. I would then pour it from the vodka bottle into the drinks bottle. The vodka bottle would stay in the shed that night, and I would bring the cycling bottle up, and it would get stashed at a shelf in the utility room above our microwave. And there was a small amount of planning behind that, because it's actually a shelf that my wife can reach, but not easily. It's just that I'm only 4 or 5 inches taller than my wife, but that shelf was just a little bit out of reach for her. So that seemed like a sensible place. And I had, going back to the collecting, I used to be a collector of cycling drinks bottles, so I had a fair stash there. So, I probably had 15 stashed up there. And again, I was just taking the gamble that if I put it right at the back, no one would have any reason to look there, and it was hard to access anyway, so that was that.
Okay, because when I'd read this before, I had visions in my head of every time that you wanted a drink and you're hiding it in the shed, that you were popping out down the shed over the course of an evening for a big swig or something like that. And then it kind of dawned on me that you might be walking back up the garden, just increasingly more pissed the more journeys that you take. And that would be hard to hide. But you just kind of explained that, there was none of that really.
There was a bit of that for a while. And that was when, unfortunately, the infamous drunk stew, about 11 o'clock. I remember it because I don't know why, but I had it in my head that I had to go back. I'd obviously probably poured half a bottle of vodka out and drunk it and thought, I'm going to go for it at 11 o'clock. And walked back and fell in our pond, which was not. It's
Well,
not a deep
all the way in.
Yeah, no, it was probably 1.5 feet deep at its lowest point. But I went 2 feet in, stumbled, got pretty wet. But again, this is the deception, if you like. That was an easy journey because our bedroom was the front of the house, so it was the other end of the house. So it was, it's all about the planning. I would never have. That was again, I'd worked out that round the back was no problem because I could make cock-ups like that and wouldn't be detected. Sounds silly, but it's little things that go through. But yeah, I fell in the pond. I had wet feet, probably disturbed a few ponds, frogs and newts, but never mind, they'll forgive me.
Okay, that's quite funny. Okay, so let's come back up to the house then. Anywhere ingenious? Not like we said at the beginning of the show. We're not making we're not lighthearted about this. I don't want to make it sound like there's somewhere that you should be proud of finding somewhere that was brilliant to hide it. But I'm just trying to get a flavour for just the lengths that you will go to, either in different houses that you've lived in or anything like that. So, what was the hardest then? Not ingenious. What was the hardest that you had to work to hide your alcohol?
It was the hardest was probably our second ski season in France, and I did experience a period of what I would look back on and call alcoholic drinking. When my wife would go to work in the afternoons, we lived in a very small flat. And I would sneak down to the co-op at the spa at the bottom of the road and buy 2 bottles of red wine if I was going out with the lads. That was my pre-drink. And I don't know why, because I literally had to walk past the bins on the way out, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to risk being seen. So I used to stash wine bottles behind or under the bath in a tiny flat I worked at. I probably bashed it with my foot once and realised that there was the wood was loose and there was a gap. That wasn't too often, and again, that's to laziness. With regards to at home, I stuck with that spot. I had some lesser alcohol. I used to have bottles of wine, maybe 1 or 2, hidden in boxes in the spare room, and that was. I just used to run the risk that no one would ever look there because there was no reason to look in those boxes. It was full of my old crap. But no, there was no ingenious places because the place that I used first above the microwave on the high shelf, it just seemed to work. My wife had no reason to look there, so that worked really.
Okay. So I'm going to flip the other side. So we've been talking about kind of hiding your alcohol, and getting away with drinking it in secret in some cases, or when you know that it's what you're drinking will be frowned upon in terms of volume. The other side of that is you've got to get rid of the evidence as well.
Yeah.
How was that? How was that? Let's just go with that. And tell me.
Probably my reaction when you mentioned that was because that was, if you don't struggle with anxiety as an addict, that will give you anxiety. That is, I mean, I don't like, AA is another thing that we will discuss down the line. We're not meant to, I won't name names, but if you sit in on a meeting as such, that is, and there will be people who will tell you that is a job in itself, and a stressful one. I used to hate that. I used to, so as I've just explained, in the early times, I would leave the vodka back in the bike, and then I would take the bike to work. And obviously, I couldn't do it. I'd have to get rid of the bottle before I got to work. So I would go through spells of using dustbins, adjusting my route because I didn't want to use the same dustbin, adjusting my route because I go to work at 5 a.m. and I don't want to make noise. Also, I'd adjust my route to find bins away from residential areas. Not that anyone would be looking out of their window at 5 a.m, but my frazzled, anxious brain worried about that. I'm a bit ashamed to admit that I lobbed a lot of empty vodka bottles into surrounding woodlands. Again, not something I'm proud of at all, actually. but that was out of nothing but laziness. But I built up a stash in the compost heap for a while, probably 10 vodka bottles, and then trying to move 10 vodka bottles quietly at 5 a.m. Oh, it was well, you can't do it without sounding like someone carrying 10 empty vodka bottles.
Yeah. So it sounds like, well, you've just said, the thought process and the planning required. I actually think this must be really exhausting mentally. Yes. To have the wherewithal and the planning to kind of go, I'm going to take a different route most days. I'm going to avoid obvious routines that might draw attention to the fact that, oh, there's the guy who dropped his bottles in that same bin next to Sainsbury's on the way, which I can fully imagine that. So this is from an anxiety point of view, and again, we're kind of planning a kind of a mental health sort of episode and anxiety, but is the anxiety developing and worsening, do you think, because you have this almighty secret that's burdening you now?
Yeah, it got to a point where as we know, towards the end, every minute of the day, my brain was consumed with thoughts of alcohol. But yeah, bear in mind, I'm certainly not looking for sympathy, but just to outline it, if I'm awake for 18 hours a day, I'm trying to fit 8 hours of drinking into that day. I'm trying to fit 8 hours of work. I'm trying to fit being a husband, a dad, trying to cook dinner, trying to water my tomatoes, working out, how I'm going to get rid of if I'm in the car, well, I don't want to get spotted in the car, dropping my bottles off, and that's when we will discuss more in the mental. When I'm so on edge in your mental health and your anxiety, it only takes that much to throw you completely off kilter. My reactions to silly things like, let's say, a burnt bit of toast. I very rarely burnt the toast, but it would be something as simple as that in that highly anxious state that could completely throw me and make life for anyone around me almost unbearable, I would imagine.
Okay. Something else has just occurred to me. Was there any concern at any point for you with, like you say, you're going to work at 5 o'clock in the morning, but you've referenced a number of times that you're still drinking at 11. Ever concern you at any point that you're going to be over the limit and you're going to lose your license if you get stopped?
No. No, it should have. It didn't, and I used to. It's something I've moaned at other people in my profession over the years. Again, I'd done it as a young greenkeeper when I wasn't an alcoholic. I'd partied till sort of 11, 12, 1 and driven to work at 5. But yeah, I wouldn't. I'd have had 6 hours sleep, but I'd have blown the machine up every single morning. Yeah, and I think, looking back, it's not a good answer. It's not an excuse, but I would take the bicycle. I took the bicycle for a lot of times because I just thought I could probably cause less damage on a bicycle. So the car. I cycled the winter before. So I stopped drinking in 2017. The winter before, the winter of 2016. I cycled all winter. I wasn't drinking terribly. I was drinking a lot, but I cycled all winter then. It got to the point where I was so mentally and physically poorly that I couldn't cycle anymore. But no, if I'm perfectly honest, it didn't really cross my mind.
Yeah, no, and I think it's kind of, again, just going right back to the beginning. I think the context is really important in that your ability to rationalize as an addict. You can block some things out, and anybody can rationalize anything. we've seen that during COVID, that people can break lockdown rules because they want to get their hair done and all the rest of it. Yeah. So anyone can rationalize anything in any circumstance. And I think, driving to work after having 6 hours sleep is, and I think the vast majority of people that will listen to this will be able to hold their hand up and say, I can relate to the fact that I've had a late night and had to go to work the next morning, and probably, if not been over the limit, have been close to it and too close for comfort.
Yeah.
But I think that comes with, again, a bigger risk in that if you get stopped by the police and you're over the limit, it will bring questions out from those around you as well, which might have been a hard one to deal with.
Yeah, because obviously, had I, in those later months, had I been stopped and blown over the limit, maybe the police officer would have said to my wife, or my wife would have said, well, you only had 3 ciders last night, and you went to bed at 10 o'clock, and you've blown in the bag at 6 o'clock the next day, and it's over the limit, and I'd have been buggered because I hadn't had 3 cans of cider. I'd had a bottle of vodka and 3 cans of cider.
Yeah, and all these hypotheticals, but it depends when they would stop you as well, because if you've got 3 bottles of vodka that you're ready to ditch on your way to work,
yes, I mean it does. It almost doesn't bear thinking about, but that's what we're here to tackle or address these issues.
No, I get that. So we had a question around. So we had a listener's question. Another one came in. I got to empty the sack again this week of letters. So this one was around it kind of links into. So there is a little bit of a behaviour change There's a behaviour change around when you've got a newborn in the house, and I think from my experience and others around me, we've seen that friendships change a little bit when there's a baby in the house, because you're not quite as free as you were. You can't go out socially like you were, and so that either those friendships change or the nature of those friendships change. So I guess the first one was, did that happen for you? So 3 parts, and we can come back to it. So firstly, did that happen to you? Secondly, was that useful to kind of cover your escalating intake? And third really is, if they would have known in the midst of your heaviest drinking, how do you think that might have affected? Do you think they would have just been like, okay, we can't be around Stuart because he can't be around the alcohol? Or would they have been more relaxed in that and just kind of go, well, if he's going to drink, he's going to drink? So, 3 questions in that.
So if we start from the first point you made, did it change my friendships or relationships? Since we moved back in 2014, before my wife became pregnant, we were sort of our own drinking buddies, because my sort of 2 best drinking buddies, Cookie, or my best mate Cookie, doesn't live local, and Northie, being for what he does in a profession, he's away a lot. So I didn't really I didn't have my drinking buddies around much. I obviously formed other friendships, and we had a social circle that we would drink with, but it didn't really affect that. I'd withdrawn, maybe, I don't know if it was the anxiety, but since we'd been back and living in Kent again, I wasn't making as much of an effort to be a good friend. I was avoiding family social gatherings, and I don't know why. I was drinking a lot then. If we look back, it would have been a state of, mental unwellness, if that's even a word. I would have been struggling with something, and I was drinking even back. I've always drunk more than probably the average person has, and so to answer that, no, it didn't really affect that, but purely based on the fact that I think my social interactions had changed before that anyway. I'd come from the ski resorts where I was a ski bum, in essence, working long hours at the weekend, but socialising a lot. But when I got back, just slipped back into that routine of going to work. Don't go to the pub after work like you do in a ski resort. And the weekends, me and my wife would enjoy a party. But then we got married, and not long after that, bought a house. Money would have been a little bit tighter. And we fell pregnant not long after that. So that's hopefully that's answered part one a bit for you, Phil.
Yeah. So and as well that so the question was it useful to cover or hide your escalating intake? But I guess if some of those ties had that you had, or those friendships had changed anyway because you had been away for a period of time and come back, and then they also live away, you kind of not really with it. That kind of needed to hide, it wasn't there. So what about the hypothetical? In the middle of drinking.
Oh, hang on, I've lost you.
Let's say within the last 2 years of your drinking, when it was starting. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm with you now, mate. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just note that down. 31:21. Okay. So let's talk about that hypothetical then of if we're thinking about the last 18 months, 2 years of your heavy drinking, if your friends would have found out, how, I mean, I know the people that you're talking about, and I know they're good people, but in the midst of all of kind of, do you think they would have just been like, let's give Stu some distance because he shouldn't be around drink anymore? Or how do you think that would have played out during the worst times? I think their reaction when you've been unwell and hospitalized is different to, just kind of you coming out with it, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't know. It's where I don't know how people would have reacted. Knowing how people have reacted since I've stopped drinking, they would have reacted the same. They'd have been fully supportive. But had I know people's reactions to brief periods when people try and have time away from the alcohol. It goes against society in a way, I remember I had a period of trying to lay off the alcohol when I lived in Holland the first year, and we had friends come out to visit. James, my good friend James, actually came out to visit, and I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning it. We went out for an evening meal, and I said I wasn't going to be drinking, and I didn't get hammered for it, but I was the butt of the jokes around the table. I'd have done the same, but I went home and I thought to myself, that just wasn't worth it. It's not that they should have supported me. It's not about that. But I said I'm not going to have a drink, and everyone was just like, but we're going out for dinner. Almost, we've got to have a drink.
Yeah.
And I couldn't have. Yeah, if I wasn't going to have a drink, I would never have gone down the pub to see my mates and said, "Oh, I'm just going to drink Diet Coke," because I know what I'd have said to someone who'd done that. So it just, probably not.
I think it's no, it is. I think it's we established in the last 2 episodes that when you were drinking and you were socializing, you were really enjoying it.
Yeah.
And actually, the alcohol was part of that. So if you're going to go and have a drink of Coke, and and also your friends are going to turn on you, but lightheartedly, they're going to give you some shit, because actually, if you're going to dish it out, Stu, you've got to be able to take it.
Yeah, and I could out.
Yeah, exactly. But then what you've just described is that doesn't sound like a lot of fun to anybody. You've just removed 2 of the fundamental parts of the thing that you really enjoy. It's the alcohol and the banter. And if you're the butt of the banter the whole night, that isn't fun.
There's a very easy way to avoid it, and just don't go out.
Yeah. Or drink.
Yeah, yeah, or
Yeah,
drink, which was what I
yeah,
chose to do.
yeah. Okay, so I'm just conscious of the time. I think and we will do a part two because there's quite a lot more that I want to get through. But close calls is where I want to go next. Any occasions where you were either so close to being caught or so close to telling everybody that there was a problem?
Close calls were actually few and far between. Like I say, it's hard to explain. In my house, in our old house, it's not an open planned living area, so I had to make a journey from the living room to the kitchen down the corridor. So I would always go and top up my wife's wine glass and top up my cider glass, and I got very good at topping up my cider glass and either necking a neat vodka or just pouring vodka from the aforementioned hidden vodka bottle into the bottom of my cider. So, I would be. So that was, and a couple of times my wife would have got up maybe to come through the kitchen to go down to the downstairs loo to have a wee. I never got caught in the act of pouring the vodka out. The times that I would have been closest to actually getting caught out would have been drinking when I got in from work and misjudging it. Either, let's say, I was tired, maybe I hadn't eaten, or it had been a particularly hot day and my body had reacted to the alcohol differently, or I had simply just consumed too much. So my wife would get home and I might be stumbling or slurring my words. Again, a not so clever story. On more than one occasion, my wife would come home and I'd have dinner in the oven, but I hadn't turned the oven on because I was pissed. So
Yeah.
there'd be chicken Kievs and chips sitting in the oven, and and silly.
Hoping global warming has an effect.
Yeah,
Kicking in the
but
boiler. Yeah.
but no, close calls like that. Towards the end, when things were, let's say, the wheels were coming off, and I'd given up caring a little bit. I was getting very sloppy with. I had numerous stashes towards the end. We'll probably discuss that later. But I was leaving mixers, cramp bottles. I remember one time my wife found a bottle of cranberry juice in my rucksack, and obviously she wanted to know what she kind of knew what it was for, but obviously she had to ask, and I had to lie some bullshit, took it to work. But she said, oh, it's semi cold, it feels like it's been in the fridge. And then we both look at each other and know I'm lying, but do we want to have the stand up argument? No. So
Yep.
to answer the second part, times. It could be I got a phone call like times when I nearly told people. I got a phone call from a doctor once who'd been trying to trace me because of some early blood tests I'd had with regards to general health problems that were alcohol related. I hadn't told anyone they were. And I got a phone call. He'd been trying to reach me on numerous numbers. He phoned me one day to tell me he'd been trying to contact me for 2 days on old landlines. One of my blood tests, he said, I can only assume it's a mistake, but my cholesterol levels and some other levels, I can't remember the details, but he said, if these are real, you are a heart attack and a stroke waiting to happen. You need to report to A and E and get some blood taken. I had a bottle of vodka stashed upstairs. My wife was sunbathing in the garden. I went upstairs, poured the vodka in the kitchen sink, told myself I was never going to drink again, and I was going to tell my wife everything. I went downstairs and didn't tell her everything, but we did go to hospital. I assumed I was going to get told I had cancer, by the way, the doctor's voicemail. But as it happened, hospital was busy. The woman said, "Oh, have you got a reference number or anything, or why have you been sent here?" I said, "Well, I've had a voicemail from the doctor." She said, I'm not going to take any blood. You need to go home and consult your GP." I drank 48 hours later. Yeah, and forgot about it. Mad. Absolutely crazy.
Okay, so I don't want to end our episode without asking that question. So that's kind of on the tip of my tongue. But you've had a reasonable wake-up call there, a health-related wake-up call, and you've just said you were drinking within 48 hours. Can you pinpoint why? Was it just kind of I don't want to deal with it, so I'm not going to?
Strangely, in the process of the voicemail he left me was about 2 minutes long. After about 30 seconds, I assumed the voicemail was going to end with him telling me that I had cancer from some blood tests that he'd taken, when the nature of the voicemail was obvious that it was basically because of my alcohol consumption, even though he didn't know how much alcohol I was consuming. So I dodged a massive bullet in my head, and I can't recall exactly, but I probably thought I'll moderate my consumption. I can deal with this. It's not. I really did. When I listened to the voicemail, the first 30 seconds, my arse fell out, and I thought he's going to tell me they found something horrific in this blood work, and he didn't. He just said my cholesterol, and I'm not a medical professional, but I understood well enough that this was all down to what I was. I knew how much I was drinking.
Okay, so is there a chance then that there was almost a relief in the outcome of it, and actually your health was in your hands, in your control?
I could still save this. I could still turn it around. Right. I didn't have cancer, and I don't want to. My dad struggles with that awful disease. It is an awful disease, but I thought that's what he was going to tell me, and then I was like, oh, I just need to drink less, and this will sort itself out. And it was almost like, phew, thank God for that.
Yeah.
Mad.
No, I think when you work through the logic through the lens of addiction.
Yeah.
Like we said earlier on, you can justify everything.
And I did.
Yeah. Alrighty. I think that's a kind of a convenient place to stop for this episode. I think there's quite a lot to do, because we talked about relationships, and we've talked a little bit about friends and your drinking buddies, but I think we had planned out that we're going to talk a bit more about your close family, because your parents live nearby, you've got brothers, you're obviously married, and while we're not going to go too much into the great detail with it, I want to kind of address those sorts of areas as well, because I think that they are some of the people that are most affected by this whole situation as well. So I think understanding the impact on them will be of interest. So no, we'll call it quits for tonight, if that's all right.
Yes. Well done.
Okay. Well done you. Well done you. Okay, so for the listeners then, thank you for taking the time to listen to Henry Weston's Old Mate, the podcast. You can still follow us on Twitter at StewButts, and we've got a Gmail account now. It's hwomthepod@gmail.com. So questions can be directed in either of those two areas, and we'll pick them up. And we've shown that we've had listeners' questions, so we'll throw them in. So Stu, we'll meet up again very soon, and we will record part 2 of this one. But until then, keep safe, and we'll speak soon.
Yeah, Phil, thanks for your time, mate. Brilliant. Cheers.
Cheers, mate. Bye.